We're live.
Hey, good to see you, my EOS friends. I'm taking over for June for just a few hours here so we'll continue on as we have been. And I'm from EOS San Francisco, block producer and the EOS podcast. I'm introducing Myles Snider, awesome EOS community member here from EOS Aurora. And Myles is going to talk to us about social scalability. So Myles, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hey everybody, super glad to be here. This is my first time doing one of these things, so apologize for the poor lighting, but I'm going to go into some slides soon. So yeah, without further ado, I'll get into it. So what I'm going to be talking about is social scalability. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the idea of social scalability is this idea that networks like EOS, and in fact, all blockchain networks have to have some form, they need to scale if they want to support users all around the globe. And I think people traditionally think about a very particular subset of scalability, which is just the technological scalability. So how much throughput can you get? What are the transactions per second? How many dApps can you support? And all of these things are really important, but there's this other side of scalability that relates more to, I think, the governance side of things that I would contend is equally important. And this idea of social scalability, especially in the blockchain context, was first outlined by Nick Szabo, who is the father of smart contracts, one of the sort of OGs of Bitcoin. He invented BitGold before Bitcoin was even created. And he talks about how social scalability is the ability for an institution to overcome shortcomings in human minds and in the motivating or constraining aspects of said institution to limit how many people can successfully participate. So in other words, how can you scale a network to have millions or even billions of users, hundreds of thousands of applications running on top of it without devolving into chaos? And how do you create a system for governance that's structured and lets disputes get resolved within the community without destroying the community? And how do you prevent disagreements regarding interpretation or opinion from sort of collapsing the actual protocol itself? And so I would contend that social scalability is very closely related to governance. And I actually gave this same presentation at the Scaling Blockchain Conference in San Francisco. And I'll dive into a lot of the same things here, but I want to talk about some of the more sort of recent updates as well. So with social scalability, you kind of have a trade-off. You look at previous projects like Bitcoin or Ethereum, they attempted to do sort of a code as law approach. They said, okay, we're going to create a platform. It's going to function like this. You're going to write your code and it's going to be executed and humans are going to have no say. So that's what code as law means. The problem with that is that, when things go wrong, you have a lot of issues. But the advantage you get is that it's you have very strong guarantees about how the protocol is going to act in any given situation. So we have pretty strong guarantees about how something like Bitcoin is going to behave, how it's behaved in the past, and how it's going to behave in the future. Ethereum, to some extent, sort of in theory, we have those guarantees. But we've seen things like the DAO hack or the parity multisig bug that have, in which the code has behaved in unexpected ways. And that's when you run into the limits of code as law. So the other side of the approach is to sort of have a very flexible protocol that allows for fixes and can be changed when things go wrong. But what you get in return is weaker guarantees about how the protocol is going to behave. So one of the questions that EOS was attempting to answer is, can we find some sort of trade-off in between those two things that's actually suitable for getting real-world adoption? For offering strong guarantees that offering the strong guarantees that make blockchains compelling, but also for offering enough room for fixes in the case of these inevitable errors that we can actually get people to build on it. So, I sort of talked about with Bitcoin, how they take a very rigid code as law approach. But what we've seen with some of the things in Bitcoin is that, there's been major bugs. And in that case, you can't really have code as law, because if code were law, then you would just have those bugs be exploited and no one could really do anything about it. But we have seen when things go wrong, core developers still do have to step in and try and fix some of these things. We've also seen, disagreements in the community that actually splinter the community. So disagreements about what Bitcoin is, the interpretation of what this tool should be and what it should be used for. And that's where we saw things like Bitcoin Cash and then eventually Bitcoin Cash itself split. Ethereum, when it first launched, attempted to take this very rigid code is law approach. And they actually, on their website, they said things like code is law and build unstoppable applications. But they really ran into the problems there when you had the DAO hack. And so this was one of the largest smart contracts built on Ethereum at the time. It contained a huge percentage of the total Ether in circulation was actually locked up in this contract, and this contract was exploited by a hacker. And if you were if you took a very pure code is law approach, then you should say, well, the hackers simply, they exploited something that was there in the code, and if code is law, then they should be allowed to run with that exploit. But obviously, a lot of the community didn't want that to happen. So you saw the community kind of split in terms of thinking about, whether we should hard fork to revert the effects of this attack or whether we should just continue. And one of the interesting things that the Ethereum community did that was kind of a departure from code is law is they held what's called a carbon vote. So they held an on-chain vote where Ether token holders could actually say, yes, we should fork, or no, we shouldn't. However, the problem with this vote was that voting was never really baked into the social contract of Ethereum. Very few people who were Ether holders had considered that voting would be something that would take place. Very few people really knew about the vote. And as a result, you had super, super low turnout for the vote. And if you look at this breakdown here on screen, you can see that one voter made up, a pretty big portion of the vote in favor of the fork. But if you look at what the total Ether supply, the number of tokens that actually voted was quite small. And what you got was once again, a fork and a split in the Ethereum community. So this community split into two smaller communities that were, you could contend that each one was weaker than the overall community that had existed before. So for the EOS community, we really have to think about, how do we learn from these past mistakes, and how do we build a system that can socially scale and that can maybe avoid some of these problems. And I think one of the really important things here is knowing that you need the right systems in place for governance to have this function in a proper way. And governance is not an easy thing to solve, and we're seeing right now that the EOS community is very much in the process of trying to make sure that the governance works in a healthy manner. So, what are the risks for something that can't socially scale? And I think this needs to be a really big consideration for EOS token holders as the network moves forward. Well, we've seen forks that sort of destroy the value of the network. They fragment the community. Public perception becomes highly skewed. I think we've seen that with Bitcoin Cash, and especially the forks within Bitcoin Cash. You get a lot of confusion and chaos. If anyone was kind of following along in real time for the Ethereum DAO hack, they probably saw some of the chaos that created within the community. You can discourage new developers, new entrepreneurs, new enterprises from joining the system because once again you've sort of created weaker guarantees around what they're getting into. And then, if the fork is bad enough or if the disagreements are bad enough or if the social scalability is low enough, well, market value is going to fall because people are just going to sell out of their position because, investors don't like uncertainty. So, this is just a collection of some of the headlines we've seen with regards to EOS governance and some of the problems that it's run into. And this, I think, relates to what I was saying earlier about, public perception. It really does matter. And having a system that can't socially scale makes these matters a lot worse. So when I talk about the EOS governance stack, I kind of like to break it down into 4 layers. So you've got stake-weighted voting, which is voting for BPs. And, in the future, voting for referenda. You've got block producers acting as sort of elected representatives, where they can use a 15 out of 21 approval to implement changes to the network. And we've actually seen them do that a number of times. You've got the constitution or the user agreement or the platform agreement, whatever you want to call it, which is kind of this peer-to-peer terms of service agreement. And then you've got arbitration. So currently we've got ECAF, but in the next constitution, we'll formalize the structure. And I think it can be helpful to kind of break down this governance stack and think about what in this stack, as it's currently enacted, scales socially and what doesn't. And in particular, I think, arbitration at the base layer is something that really doesn't scale socially, and I'll talk more about that. So one of the problems we have with the Constitution is that this Constitution is a document that is sort of shared by the community, and it's meant to be this Schelling point, this signal, or this document upon which we can all converge and say, well, here are sort of the rules or the guidelines or boundaries that the community has set. However, we've already seen this become somewhat problematic, because the Constitution, as it's written today, contains a lot of provisions in there that are unenforceable, that have been broken by either block producers or community members, rules that there's that not everyone agrees upon, and you also sort of have this one document that maybe is written in one language initially and then translated into other languages, and there's questions about whether the translation copies over perfectly. There's questions around interpretation. There's questions around the extent of the authority of whoever is named in the Constitution, and all of these provisions within the Constitution create potential disagreements around the interpretation of them. And that's why I think, and I've been saying this for a while, that the goal of a Constitution should really be to create a document that is as simple as possible and only serves the basic need around a Constitution, which, in my opinion, is sort of defining the parameters of governance and defining the expected behavior of block producers. Because one of the things we've seen is that the Constitution by itself is not actually enforceable. The only thing that's enforceable is whatever the voters choose to enforce. So if there's something that's said in the Constitution, for example, block producers aren't allowed to buy votes, well, that in and of itself doesn't prevent block producers from buying votes. If a block producer is caught buying votes, even though that's against the Constitution, they will actually stay in their position unless they're voted out by token holders. So when you have something that's not actually enforceable, it creates some issues unless the voters are willing to step in and enforce it. So I think the fact that we've seen, with the current Constitution, we've seen some of those provisions broken, tells us the extent to which that can be a useful tool. And so, some of the other things that are going on right now, you've got low voter participation. The referendum is still in the process of being upgraded to a system level contract, and we haven't held the first referendum yet. And then we've also got, confusion and disagreement around ECAF, which I'll dive into in a second. So right now, EOS is at this very critical stage. We're very early. We're 6 months into the network. We're kind of in a bear market. There's a lot of room for growth. And I think now is the time when we really need to put the right structures in place, that as the number of users grows, as the number of block producers grows, as the number of developers grows, enterprises, applications that are built on top of the system grows, we need to have structures in place that minimize the amount of room for disagreement, what some people have called the argumentation surface, that allow disagreements to be resolved in a way that is more structured, and that doesn't leave so much room for interpretation that it can actually fragment the community. So I'm going to go back into video now. And I'll sort of end with talking about some of the recent thoughts that I've had around specifically ECAF and arbitration. If any of you guys are interested in diving a little further into this subject, we recently launched a podcast called the EOS Voter Podcast. It's available on all the major platforms. And in our last episode, we interviewed Marcin Zentek from Tokenica, who has been sort of leading the charge on what I would call a sensible approach to governance and arbitration. And he and I had a long discussion about this subject that, I'd encourage you to go listen to. But what we're seeing now is that ECAF is this party that exists within EOS, and has some authority from the Constitution, but the extent of their authority and the source of their authority and the sort of the scope of what they need to be ruling on has not been defined. And that has created, so many questions within the community and within block producers around, what exactly is ECAF? You know, should we be listening to them? And, you know, like, are they a legitimate party within the EOS ecosystem? Are they actually part of the core governance structure of EOS, or should they exist as sort of like a layer on top of the rest of the governance? And I would contend that what you have with ECAF in its current form, and part of the reason that I've been encouraging the community in the first referendum to adopt a new constitution that doesn't include ECAF at the base layer, is that you have a system that kind of breaks the core security assumptions of delegated proof of stake. So with delegated proof of stake, you have an on-chain token holder vote that elects you know, a group of 21 at any given time block producers who are sort of the stewards of the network. And if any one of those block producers is compromised or acts maliciously or behaves in a way that the token holders don't like, well, there's a very clear check on their power in the form of token holders voting them out. So they have a very clear source of authority, which is being voted in by token holders. And there's very clear checks and balances on their power, which is token holders being able to vote them out. And I think the most important thing is that among those block producers, power is completely evenly distributed. So if a government or some large corporation or whoever it may be wanted to attack the EOS network and they took out any single block producer, the network is actually designed to withstand that kind of attack. Nothing is going to happen to the network if one block producer goes down. So you've got checks and balances, clear source of authority, and distributed control, all of which are super, super important in any blockchain system. With ECAF, what you introduce is a sort of single party within that system that has a very loosely defined source of authority, no real clear checks and balances on that power. And I think most importantly, it is a single party that if it were to be compromised or infiltrated or anything like that, it actually represents a single point of failure for the network. And one of the arguments against that point of view has been that block producers sort of have the ultimate say in deciding whether or not to enforce ECAF's rulings. However, I think when you have a situation in which ECAF is given authority in the Constitution and the block producers pledge to uphold the Constitution, then you shouldn't have a system in which block producers need to sort of filter through ECAF decisions and decide which ones to enforce and which ones not to. That kind of undermines the point of having a Constitution. I think that instead, you should have a system in which arbitration exists as a layer above the base layer, whether that's at the application layer or the service provider layer, or just as an opt-in service. And I think there's a lot of other ways that we can go about getting the results that we want out of ECAF, which is to make EOS the most safe and user-friendly blockchain in history without breaking the security model of the network. So, I know I'm reaching kind of my time limits, but if you're interested in diving more into this issue, please listen to my podcast with Marcin. Check out the Aurora EOS blog where we've written a number of pieces about this issue, and then feel free to reach out in any of our channels and ping me with questions. So I think that's about 15 minutes, and I can kind of go into some Q&A now. Brandon, I don't know if you want to hop on or if I should just take them in the chat.
Oh, I'm here, but if it doesn't look like the QA is going too fast for you to handle, so if someone has a question, they can just drop it in the chat and you can read it.
Cool.
And if there's not questions, the next person that we're bringing in is Amy, and I think that June's working on getting her set up right now. So we'll just.
Awesome, Brandon. Looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, so this is a comment from Ian Grigg, which is, how does the DAO get resolved if there is no base layer arbitration? So I think this gets to a pretty important point, and I think one of the major points of confusion around ECAF, which is that what is the scope of ECAF's authority and their decision making? Is ECAF resolving sort of system level disputes around things like the DAO hack, or are they taking cases related to petty theft or small cases of theft? And thus far we've seen the latter. ECAF's first ruling was related to supposed theft of private keys that occurred in the transfer from the Ethereum blockchain to the EOS mainnet. and that. Sorry, Ian says scope is very clear, and the Constitution is all disputes out of or related to EOS. So yeah, so the idea behind this is that ECAF is sort of the arbitrator of last resort. So unless someone specifies another arbitrator, then ECAF handles everything else. I don't think that's scalable. I think we've already seen that ECAF has been sort of inundated with a large number of cases. We've seen a lot of cases where ECAF sort of just isn't able to actually resolve the disputes because they aren't able to contact the counterparty. The tokens moved out of the system into an exchange too fast, anything like that. So my suggestion for something of the DAO level hack is that this is exactly what DPoS is meant to address. As token holders, we elect a set of block producers who act as the stewards of the network at any given time. So I think that if we had a systems level failure or a failure on the scale of the DAO hack, that's something that can be resolved by a 15 out of 21 block producer decision. I think ideally with some sort of time delay for major decisions like that for block producers, which would allow token holders to then vote out those block producers if they disagreed with the decision, or vote in new ones to replace them. And I think that it's sort of like if you view DPoS as this like corporate governance structure that's decentralized and fully transparent, the block producers act like the board of directors at any given time. So if something happens to the corporation, or in this case the network, the block producers are the ones who step in and resolve it. And I think in particular, what you can do is you can combine that with on-chain referenda. So the referenda, what it's really useful for is it's a way that you can poll the entire community in a verifiable on-chain way that reflects people's token holders' opinion on any given topic proportional to their stake. So if you had a DAO level crisis, you could actually have that not only do the block producers sort of decide how to handle it, but you could hold a community vote to say, okay, do we think the block producers should freeze this account or revert back to a point in time before this hack happened or something like that. And that to me is what's really useful about referenda, is that you can kind of use it as this signal that can guide the block producer's decision at any given time. But I think if you had a DAO level hack and it were up to ECAF to resolve, I think that's kind of, that again brings up the attack vector question. ECAF becomes this single party that supposedly has binding decision-making power over really, really important questions to the network, and they haven't been given authority by token holders. As an EOS token holder myself, I would I want the block producers who I elected in a verifiable on-chain way to be the decision makers for the network at any given time.
Great stuff, Myles. Thank you, man. That was really informative. We're going to move on to the next speaker here, Amy, and June's going to start bringing her in here right now. So, Myles, if you want to give a farewell to all your EOS friends out there, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for having me, June. Thanks for hosting, Brandon. Really, this was fun. Hope to do it again. Ian, thank you for the questions. Always happy to talk about this subject. And looking forward to seeing everyone soon. Bye.
Thanks, Myles. All right. Well, welcome, Amy. She's going to take a second to get set up here, possibly. And Amy is from Sagewise and SendEOS, and the recent winner of the EOS San Francisco and EOS Ignite virtual hackathon. So congratulations, Amy. You guys are awesome. Go ahead and talk. And yeah, you're all set. All right, take it away.
Awesome. Great. So can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I did not prepare slides today because I wanted to give more so a frank talk on where we are in terms of, I hate calling it arbitration because I don't think it's arbitration. It's dispute resolution, right? So, a few months ago, I was tapped to chair the EOS Alliance Dispute Resolution and Arbitration Working Group. And we've got a lot of really great expertise in that working group. We've got, for example, Colin Rule. He is basically one of the grandfathers of dispute resolution. He helped architect PayPal eBay's dispute resolution system, and they resolve over 60 million disputes a year, only 5% of which are ever touched by a human being, right? And we have other folks from Electronic Frontier Foundation, things of that sort. Before I begin, I want to make clear, though, that the perspective at which I'm coming from is one that is, I would like to think it's very neutral, right? Of course, we've had experts within our working group have very strong opinions, all different ways about how this should work out, although most of the folks who have worked in online dispute resolution before do think that having some sort of layer of dispute resolution is quite important. And I also want to point out that we stand as agnostic to ECAF, right? And so we are, I want to say we're trying to be more apolitical in that we're neither for nor against it. We're more so taking a tempered approach into looking into, what truly is best for the network. I'm not going to go over today all the arguments over, what is dispute resolution, what is arbitration, all those 101 very beginning conversations we already had a couple months ago, and you can find the main points over on Medium. You can find the actual videos of these conversations on YouTube. So they're there, you just have to search for them. Instead, what I wanted to give you guys is kind of a preview or a heads up of what we have internally circulated as a working group and what we're going to be proposing to the entire EOS network, and what you guys want to do with it, whether you want it to go up for referendum, whether you want to further discuss it, make some tweaks, that's up to the community. This is merely what we've spent months researching and thinking and proposing. So before I launch into exactly what we're proposing, I want to very quickly highlight the overarching goals, right? Because when designing any sort of dispute resolution system, I think it's very important to keep those goals in mind and understand what the entire mission of all of this is. And the mission of EOS from the original white paper was to be that public blockchain for small businesses, right? And I think it's very important to remember that. So it has to be cost effective, it has to be efficient, but basically the four principles that we came up with was scalability. This has to be scalable. We can't have people needing to pay, hundreds or thousands of dollars in EOS to get their dispute resolved when that is not something that's incredibly proportional to the size of their dispute. The second one is transparency, right? There needs to be transparency with exactly what is going on with the state of dispute resolution and arbitration in the network. The third one is fairness, and fairness means a lot of things, but it means no conflicts of interest. It means consistency across cases of different types. And then the fourth, which I think is also very important, is customer service and responsiveness, right? And this applies to not just ECAF, but it applies to, arbitration that you see today. It applies to even, if you go on Amazon today and you try to use their customer support, right? They want to provide good service and they want to provide responsiveness. Otherwise, people start feeling resentment, and then the resentment, it builds up, and people start getting really angry and taking social media, right? So all those things are very important. So we propose that there be an organization created. We're open to the name, and that organization would be headed by some sort of ombudsperson. And that ombudsperson would have a couple of different roles. first, it would be to act as a spokesperson for EOS dispute resolution, right? So it's a figurehead and a spokesperson that people can turn to for information and look to for answers. The second is to educate and socialize the EOS dispute resolution system, whatever it ends up being. The third is to report regularly on the state of dispute resolution on the EOS network in order to understand the economic health of the network and signal the types of dispute resolution providers needed. And this will be important. I'll come back to this in a little bit. Fourth is to oversee the organizations acting as a clearinghouse for disputes on the EOS network. And lastly, it's to ensure that dispute resolution providers abide by the rules and the standards that are set in place. So the architecture or the design that we are proposing is a dispute resolution system on EOS in which you basically have three different options. You can A, opt out, so if something happens, then you don't want base layer, you don't want any of that stuff, that's fine. Like, we're not going to force it on you, right? The second ability is to appoint a pre-specified dispute resolution provider, right? So it doesn't have to be ECAP. It can be a bot. It can be a crowd jury. It can be arbitrators. It could literally even be a coin flipping mechanism, whatever you want, right? But we're not going to force upon you, the user, any certain process or any certain body that you necessarily have to go to. And three, there's the default, which is if you don't set up any parameters. So you don't opt out, you don't pre-specify someone else that you would like to resolve the dispute, then what it goes through is what we call a clearinghouse process. And the clearinghouse process, I want you to keep in mind that the way we architected this was particularly for scalability, because what we don't want to see is the need to, wrangle over funds and go out and hire dozens or hundreds of case managers that have to sit there and appoint an arbitrator to a case. And that's just a lot of human resources, human involvement that we just don't think is necessary, right? So to the extent that someone doesn't specify any parameters, what would happen is they go through and they do their transaction. And if there is some sort of dispute, they would have to timely file a claim on the clearinghouse website. There's no human being in back of it. Instead, the website where they filed the claim basically contains questions that systematically filter through a large number of dispute resolution providers for an appropriate provider based on certain criteria. So that might be the disputed amount, the number of parties in this dispute, any specific or special subject matter. So basically it acts as a clearinghouse or a filtering, it's a filtering mechanism, right? And so what also exists is basically a dispute resolution provider marketplace. And that marketplace can have a wide variety of dispute resolution providers. It can have humans, it can have bots, it can resolve things for commerce transactions or finance, international trade or finance transactions or supply chain transactions. It can be a coin flipping mechanism or literally rock, paper, scissors. We believe that the process and the mechanism that is best suited is one in which the parties to the smart contract themselves agree, because they are best able to be able to sit there and say, hey, even though this is over, I don't know, a diamond ring, it's a very important diamond ring to me because, I don't know, it was owned by my grandmother. So it's not just worth the $1,000 that the market thinks it's worth. There's a lot of sentimental value attached, right? And so maybe this is not something that you want to just give over to just a regular e-commerce provider. Or e-commerce, dispute resolution service provider. So we let the parties choose, and we believe in freedom of choice. One thing that one of our experts in the working group always says is we have to fit the form to the fuss, right? So basically, what would happen is you have a dispute, you go answer a series of questions on this website, and it narrows down from all the dispute resolution providers on the marketplace, the couple that are the best suited, and then it just round robins them, right? Now, all those dispute resolution service providers would need to adhere to a certain set of standards on they're providing, and if someone makes a claim against one of them, then this organization would go through that process and determine, was a standard violated? Should we not be referring them out as a provider anymore? So that's in a nutshell. How am I doing on time? I think I've done my 10-15 minutes, and I think I only have 5 minutes for questioning, right? So, so for this proposal, I'm hearing that referendum is coming out soon, so we would like to begin to circulate it. But does anyone have any feedback? I think we have 5 minutes for Q&A, it looks like. Okay. What's this? EOS Authority. Oh, okay. Is there a question? Seven more approvals needed for EOS IO forum to be approved and referendum to go live. Perfect. Great. Do you guys have any feedback on the proposal? Do you love it? Do you hate it? I mean, the way I see it, given a lot of the sentiment in the community, is that I think it's a reasonable compromise, right? We don't want to sit on one end and say, hey, we want to kill all of this, and because that really doesn't serve the small business, which is supposed to be the end user. But on the other hand, we don't want to sit there either and say, no, we're very much wedded to what has been proposed so far, or the way things are currently working. I think the community is pretty torn. It sounds great, but can live outside whole base layer 2? Yes. So I wouldn't necessarily call this base layer or default dispute resolution, because if you truly don't want it, then you don't have to have it, right? And that's why I see it as a reasonable compromise, or a moderate approach. But it still provides at least enough protection to, I think, the average consumer who's not going to necessarily know how to sit there, and they might not even know how to opt into one of these things. A lot of small business owners aren't very technically savvy. I think it is intended to be an opt-out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, sorry. I just found the area where there was actually questions. So Ian says, have you budgeted the proposal at all? Have you looked at the conundrum of party A opting out of dispute resolution and then diddling party B who's inside? So yes, look, if I can speak from a more personal perspective, I think that we really should have base layer dispute resolution. Maybe not in the form of ECAF. I think we have to revisit what the best thing could look like, right? But at the same time, who are we to force upon a community of some people who seem to clearly not want this? Who are we to force them into recourse and safety? And so To the extent that two parties, enter into a smart contract and they really do not want any recourse, then that's freedom of contract. That's up to them, right? But if, someone is selling, you have 5 people selling a service, and one of them, it is an opt-out smart contract, and 3 of them, 4 of them have some other thing, then the consumer can sit there and say, I think I would rather go with someone who, can provide recourse, as opposed to going with a vendor that cannot. And, I believe in listening to the community, and I think we're just at that state where, people are demanding freedom of choice. So let's give them freedom of choice. Have you budgeted the proposal at all? No. Funding is one very, very big issue that we have not yet resolved. And, quite frankly, I'm not really wanting to touch it until we see what happens with the referendum and to see what happens with a worker proposal fund. If there is a worker proposal fund, then great. If not, well, I think there are a lot of big issues that we're going to be having in the network. Another question: with the future of EOS.io looking very multi-chain, do you think that chain instance abstractions is important for an effective dispute resolution architecture?
So this will be the last question, Amy.
Sure. Could you clarify? I'm not exactly sure what you mean. What do you mean by chain instance abstraction? Sorry, I'm a securities attorney, and I worked in the federal government. That's my background. I'm not an especially technical person. That's my CTO. Dan, what's chain instance abstraction?
Oh, that's a question about that.
If there are many chains, do they have the same constitution?
Oh, well,
I think that's up for the community to decide. I have not been involved too much in the constitution discussions, because I see that as outside the scope of what I was asked to do. I've been mostly focusing on the arbitration dispute resolution stuff. If yes, then dispute resolution is across the entire universe of chains. If no, then each is different. I think for every chain, I think they would have to make a decision as to what they wanted.
Cool. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate it. That was good talk. And we're going to bring on the next guest. It's going to be Yves LaRose from EOS Nation. And you can go ahead and say goodbye to everyone, Amy, and thanks for coming on.
Sure. Bye, bye, guys, and hi, Yves. Okay, so I exaggerated this thing.
Hey, Amy. Bye, Amy.
Whoa, there he is. Hey, good to see you.
How's it going, Brandon?
Doing well. I'll just let you take it away, but Yves from EOS Nation, and good to see you again, and have a good time, man. I'll see you later.
Sounds good. I'm actually going to bring you back in at some point. I'm looking at the time. It's like 7:55. I know the other session is supposed to start at 8, so I'll try to do it quickly. Those of you who know me know that I can speak for a long time. I could keep going on. I could be speaking for the next half hour, an hour.
You got your full 15 minutes, man. So you got 15 minutes. So go for it.
So what I want to talk about today is slightly different in the sense that we've been talking about. I was asked to talk about governance, and when I was looking at this at the schedule, I was thinking, okay, what could I touch upon in terms of subject? And I didn't really want this to be repetitive because we have these discussions on a daily basis on Telegram, which is one thing, but we also attend conferences. We host panels, we come on shows like this. And there's one thing that I think need to kind of come back to and take to a higher level is that there's governance on chain, but there's also governance off chain. And that's what I want to touch upon today is kind of, we tend to, in this very small world, because realistically it is very small. There's very few people in this ecosystem in the grand scheme of things. We're somewhat in a bubble. And so I want to touch upon kind of what's outside of the bubble right now, what's going on in the outside world. So we tend to be in Telegram, we tend to be in these places, we tend to do events like this, and then it's kind of an echo chamber, right? And we get in these arguments, and we start to go down the rabbit hole of very, very specific points. But if we go outside, and if I just talk to my neighbor, or because I do sometimes talk to people outside of EOS, doesn't happen very frequently. But if I do go outside and I start talking to people, most people still don't know what blockchain is. Let alone if they do know what blockchain is, and I start talking to them about blockchain, and we start talking about, all right, well, which blockchains do you know? And most of the time, people have heard of the word Bitcoin, but they don't really know exactly what it is. And then once you start talking a little bit more, all right, EOS, maybe they've heard of that, whatever. And then we go even further, and then I lose most people. Most people, the general vast population, still is not aware of EOS, let alone of governance on EOS. So this whole idea that like governance on EOS is such a big thing and it's controlling the whole world is absolutely false. Most people have no idea what's going on. And that's what I want to talk about today, is about the governance outside of the chain. And part of my job at EOS Nation is to educate people. And so I do travel quite a bit. And at EOS Nation, we do have an ambassador program, and we have a wonderful set of ambassadors. We're over 20 ambassadors now that are located in different jurisdictions throughout the world. And we really get a sense and a pulse on what's going on around the world in local jurisdictions in terms of blockchain development, in terms of EOS development, more specifically, of course, but just even in terms of blockchain development. And myself, with my background, my local jurisdiction is Canada. And so I'm in Ottawa in Canada, which happens to be the capital of Canada. And with my previous experience, I'm very close to the seat of power in Canada, the government in Canada. If I look out the window, I can see the parliament. It's really, really close by. And that's where I used to work. And that's where I had a career previously. And I was fortunate enough to be approached by some people a couple of months ago to start looking at what would we do in terms of Canadian government if we wanted to implement legislation concerning blockchain. And I think that that's really interesting, because at EOS Nation, what we try and do through our ambassadors especially is we try to host a lot of meetups, and we try to host a lot of events, educational events specifically, in person, but also off person, also online. But in person, just to give an idea, we have one of our ambassadors who last week was teaching at a high school. And he was teaching a bunch of high school kids what blockchain was, and teaching them the possibilities of what blockchain could do, how a decentralized future could, in a way, give power back to the people, and how it could, and most likely will shape their lives eventually, because we're going to see that at some point when blockchain does become mainstream, because it's a lie to think that it's anywhere near mainstream at this point. Most people have not heard of that. But when it does become mainstream, it will touch most aspects of our lives. And so to speak to high school students and to find out kind of what they're thinking about it, and have they heard about it? And if they have heard about it, how they think they'll be involved in this. That's one thing. Another one of our interns in China was teaching courses at university, and to get to hear their say on what they think blockchain is. And the questions, I've done a couple of interviews for students, especially in economics. I had one of our interns is studying at the Southwest China University in economics. And one of the questions that they kept asking was, what are we going to do with this? So blockchain is all, how is my life going to change because of blockchain? What kind of job am I going to get? What type of skill will I need once this thing actually becomes mainstream? And so you have those discussions with those people. And then at the highest level, I've had the opportunity, and I continue to have the opportunity to be able to speak to members of parliament in Canada, to be able to shape the future of legislation within Canada. And why that's important, why I wanted to talk about this tonight, and I'm going to try to do this relatively quickly, is because we have a lot of jurisdictions throughout the world that are very advanced, if that's the correct word, in terms of blockchain legislation. But we're looking at countries that are smaller. We're looking at Malta, we're looking at the Bahamas, we're looking at Gibraltar, I think is one of them. And we're looking at Switzerland. Switzerland is one of the larger ones, of course. We saw Japan in 2017 started having some legislation on the blockchain. But in the Western world, and in terms of countries that belong to the G7, Japan is in there. But Japan is not technically seen or historically seen as an innovator in terms of legislation. So if Canada were to be at the table and be able to enact legislation in terms of blockchain, typically the world starts watching. And one of the reasons why is because Canada really doesn't belong in the G7 by any conventional means. We don't have military prowess. We're not really an economic superpower. We have 37 million people. We're not really, really large. But because of our positioning, whenever Canada enacts legislation, a lot of the world watches. And so EOS Nation has the opportunity to be able to enact legislation in Canada. That's one of the projects that I'm very passionate about. One of the things that I've been working on, one of the many things that I've been working on, but one of the things that I've been working out in the real world is going to talk to members of parliament, going to talk to business leaders across the country in respective fields that are starting to adapt their businesses to be able to at some point accommodate blockchain. So either they've already started doing some projects that they believe require the blockchain, or they've already started doing things with the blockchain. But then when you go look at the parliament, when you go look at government, so in Canada, we've got the government of Canada, let's say the head branch, if you want to call it the head department that would kind of oversee the other departments, would be the Treasury Board Secretariat. And I've had some interesting meetings with representatives at the Treasury Board Secretariat, and also then at the legislative branch, the politicians, in terms of caucus, in terms of members of parliament, how they can go back to their constituents and say, listen, blockchain could be an opportunity to create jobs, to position Canada as an innovator in the world, to position any type of country that then would take legislation in order to kind of come to the 21st or 22nd century, whatever you want to call it, to position themselves and their respective populations so that they could embrace this technology. And if we were to do that, what would that look like? What kind of legislation should we have in place? Typically, most countries follow the United States in terms of legislation. So we wait to see what the SEC is going to do, and then we enact with that. But right now with blockchain, we're seeing that the US is pretty slow in order to enact legislation. So if Canada were to come at the table, and because Canada is part of the G7, what would that look like? And so I kind of want to maybe to you, Brandon, if you want to participate, or if anybody else wants to ask questions. If we were to have legislation in terms of blockchain legislation, not constitution on EOS, not ECAF, not any of this governance on chain, but actually out there in the real world per se, what type of things should we be advocating for as a community? Being very in tune and being very intimate with this technology. And because EOS itself, one of the greatest assets is the community, we also have that social, that human aspect, that social part of it. What do we want the rest of the world to know? I leave it to you guys. Do you have any questions? And Brandon, do you have any questions? What should I be advocating for in the outside world? And do we even care? Do we really think that perhaps we can keep going at it without at some point bringing most of the world out there that does not know about blockchain into this? I don't think so. I think at some point, the Western world, in order for them to start using this technology, we're going to need actual legislation off-chain. What would that look like?
It sounds like you've had some conversations possibly with legislators. What have those gone like? What has that sounded like?
So it depends on the person. So the members, so in Canada, I guess to back up, so in Canada, we've got members of parliament. We've got roughly 300, I think it's 308 at the last election, although that changes, but let's say around 300. And currently in Canada, there's a blockchain caucus that's been meeting quarterly, and they're comprised of members from across the aisle. So in Canada, we've got three major parties, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP. And this blockchain caucus formed of 30 different block producers, 30 different members of parliament is across the aisle. And so it's really interesting because it's one of those issues that really brings everybody together. It's not a platform. It's not a party. issue. It's really an innovative issue, and it's creating jobs. It's being able to see how and what this could potentially do. And so the questions that I've been getting more recently are concerning the bear market. What's going on out there? And then how does this, why would we even start looking at this when clearly it's like a volatile scam market and whatever? And that a big part of it is really educating the members of parliament in terms of what crypto assets are, what the technology is. It's really decoupling as well the technology with the use cases. So most people associate blockchain with Bitcoin. So they think blockchain equals Bitcoin. And then it's explaining that no, blockchain is a technology, just like the internet was a technology. And you have use cases. And the first use case, I guess the first live big use case was Bitcoin. And then you have more and more use cases. And even within those use cases, now you're starting to have micro use cases. So for example, EOS is a platform. On the platform, you start having use cases within that with supply chain management, with games, with gambling. You're going to have through health, through identity, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the types of questions that they're asking is what industries will be revolutionized because of blockchain technology? And what is blockchain technology? What does it do? And why do I care? How will it create jobs? Why is it important for my kids? Why should we invest in this now? How can we facilitate this? What are the dangers of this? What should we be on the lookout for? Because as regulators, as legislators, they also need to try to protect their constituency. Even though some people might not believe that that's the case, at some point, regulations are there to protect people. We can debate that. That's a whole different thing. But some of them do approach with that sense. So those are the types of questions that are being asked on right now.
Yeah, it looks like Brandon says trying to squeeze blockchain in old legislative paradigms nearly impossible. Then we have a question from Ian. I think the danger of governments is they're not really able to think about blockchain without hammering them with KYC, AML, CDD, hammer. What are your thoughts in engaging them with anonymous or non-state identity chains?
That's a really good question, Ian. I'll take that into two parts. So one, there are dangers of governance. And the way that I'll answer that part is that I think it's inevitable that at some point, if this thing called a blockchain becomes so big, we will not be able to keep governments out of it in some way, shape, or form. And if EOS indeed wants to be the blockchain for small, medium enterprises, at some point there will be legislation, outside legislation. So I'm going in with that mindset, and I might be wrong. I might be completely wrong, and I'm okay with that premise. But if indeed at some point there will be legislation, I'd rather be there to help shape it than not be at the table and have a bunch of people, like you say, who have no idea what they're doing, legislation that will affect me and other Canadians. And because it's Canada, if we enact legislation, other countries will start to look at it and might start modeling it. So I'd rather be at the table. So that's kind of no, EOS is not under Canadian jurisdiction. However, people, and one of my concerns is Canadians, and it's people from around the world. So if people from around the world are using the blockchain, they could, in some way, shape, or form, be subject to Canadian regulations. So if they're Canadian, they'd be subject to Canadian regulations, especially if they're doing business on the blockchain between, let's say, Canadian businesses or something like that. To answer the second part, in terms of KYC, AML, CDD hammer, yeah, it's possible. So one of the things that I really want to advocate is kind of that freedom that comes on the blockchain. And I might not be able to be successful at doing that, but I think that to take that position from the very beginning, to kind of explain where the roots of blockchain are, where decentralization lies, why decentralization in some aspects is very important, and which parts of decentralization should try to be kept whole when writing regulations. A concrete thing would be, for example, something that would really affect people is in Canada right now, if you trade crypto assets, the way that it's currently, and right now the Canada Revenue Agency is really not certain how it deals with this. But the idea is if you trade, let's say if you buy EOS with Bitcoin or something like that, the way that it currently works in Canada, that most people think it works in Canada, is that you have Canadian fiat, you buy into the system of crypto, the crypto system. And if you do trades in Bitcoin, then you're free from, those are free from capital gains, or those are not taxable events. And the only taxable event is when you take out the system. Because realistically, at some point, a lot of people have to take out money out of the system because they still have bills to pay. Because at the end of the day, your rent is still in fiat. It's not really in EOS, although that's changed. And when I went to Shanghai, I paid for an Airbnb in EOS. But realistically, most of our expenses are still in fiat. So at some point, we're going to go in and out of the system. What I want to do is, instead of having, for example, the Canadian government say, which I think is very similar to the US, say every exchange or every trade or something like that is a taxable event, why not let me go in that system and stay in that system? One of the things that I'm trying to do is not only that, but crypto assets are not a commodity, in my opinion. Crypto assets are not a commodity. They're not a security. It's perhaps a new asset class. If it was a new asset class, what would it look like? How could we look at that? And that's when the issue of KYC, AML, CDD, everything would come into place. Is if it's really a new asset class and we need to start thinking differently in terms of this new asset that's been created, what could that look like in this now new digital world? I'd rather be at the table, and I'd rather have other people who are forward thinkers and knowledgeable of the technology at the table than to have current legislators at the table not knowing at all what they're doing. And that's what we're seeing in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, and the kind of interesting part about working with the legislation, it's almost like a Trojan horse on in one way, where if we are working with them, then someone mentioned it's not about what it's going to revolutionize, what it's going to render toothless. I think kind of working with some of it from the inside out isn't a horrible idea. So we're coming down to the end of time. Do you have any final thoughts here, or a final question you wanted to answer, Yves?
I guess final thought is this is awesome. I love doing this. I love being in this space. I think we get, because we spend so much time here, right? So we see that people don't sleep. We see that people are in here every single day. And in here, I mean, mostly Telegram, right? And events like these, people are in here all the time. At some point, we do need to take a step back and think, if we really want this to grow, it's not the people in here that we need to convince, it's the people out there. And how do we do that? If we're not even sure where we're going internally, and if we squabble quite a bit, that's cool. We can keep it at that, but we don't necessarily need to go air our dirty laundry out. But at some point, we do need to focus on the people out there, and how can we get them in here, and how can we create the environment so that when they do come here for the first time, so that it's a pleasant experience, so that their first experience of coming in here isn't necessarily a Telegram channel, or isn't necessarily hearing a squabble about governance or something like that, but that the first experience they have is a really cool application, or it's a really cool game, or it's my mom for the first time installing something on her phone and then doing whatever that may be, whatever action that may be. And then I tell her, by the way, you just did that on the blockchain. We need to focus more on that and less on the little internal squabbles that we have in governance. Those would be my parting thoughts.
Wonderful.
Focus on the people out there. Focus on the people out there.
Cool. Yeah, a little shift in focus. It's easy to get caught up in our own little world here. So that's a great point, man. Well, it's always a pleasure to hear your thoughts.
And I'll answer your question, Brandon. All right. Take care. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, man. Good to see you. Cheers, everyone. We're going to take a short break now and get ready for the next session. So like before, maybe 5 to 10 minute break here. Go stretch, maybe do some yoga, listen to June's awesome halftime music here, and we will catch up with you shortly here. Yo, June, you're Not muted.